Everyone, welcome to a new video in which I'm going to show you a way to think about mechanization. I'm going to give you an exercise that you can do to maybe better analyze motion, to maybe come up with maybe some stock argumentation that you might be able to cross-apply to different motions, as well as giving you specific questions you can ask yourself during prep to be able to better mechanize your case. So, what are the things that we're going to talk about? The motion that I'm going to analyze is this house would break up Disney. And then the argument on the government side, which is when you break up Disney, you get more creative and diverse media. And I'm going to talk about this argument and then how I would mechanize this or how you could mechanize this. So let's just start with first just doing a bit more of what I would call like naive mechanization, where you don't really think about any specific questions. You just ask yourself this question and then you just try to come up with as many reasons as you can. Then what I'm going to do after that is I'm going to go by each question and I'm going to talk about how each question maybe interacts with different levels of mechanizations or different kinds of mechanizations to kind of like show you how things work and how they interact. So before we start, maybe just pause the video and think of reasons by yourself about why you're going to get more creative and diverse media when Disney is broken up. After you've done that, come back because then I'm going to show you mine. So these are just a couple of ideas that I came up with. The first thing is the most generic argument that you can just come up with, which is the idea of competition, which is the moment that you're going to have more like companies or more studios, then they're going to try to fight for an audience. And then we're going to go for fight for an audience. They're going to try to be like, I guess, more interesting. They're going to give you like new I don't know, new special effects. They're going to focus on like eye-catching stuff, and therefore are going to be able to or maybe cater to a specific niche to be able to get their money. That's like a more generic argument that you can run. Another thing you could talk about is Disney currently has a lot of like brand power. So Disney has brand power. So the way to see this is via, for example, name recognition. So you could say when people see that this is a new like Disney project, they are much more likely to, for example, watch the trailer or they're able to maybe think about like, I want to also see this. But there's also another way to do it. So it's like the first submech. The other submech that you could talk about is the platforms that they have. So they have, for example, Disney Plus, um, on which they're able to show, for example, ads for different shows before each other and after each other. They might be able to also have like after credits scenes, like teasing new material and that kind of stuff, like trying to merge different like universes. So you can say that because of this kind of like power that they have on these platforms as well, they're able to advertise their own kind of like shows. And then the idea is the moment that you're going to have you don't have this, you don't have this brand name, then studios need to create their own, need to create their own name, and therefore they're basically going to get more innovative because they're going to focus on something else instead. So there should be actually an arrow. So what's then another thing you could talk about? You could talk about, I guess, like the target audience of Disney. So Disney just wants to have like I guess the general public they're able to cater to, more specifically things just like families and kids. So that is why when you're talking about like for example even action movies, a lot of them are PG-13 and they're not R-rated because that means that kids are able to see them and you're able to kind of like cross apply like one audience from Star Wars to also now go to Marvel in the same way. So that's why you maybe don't get these R-rated movies and that kind of stuff. And again, here the idea is the target audience for a Marvel studio is going to be not like or Marvel or Star Wars is going to be Star Wars fans. Audience is Star Wars fans over like maybe this like Disney audience. So therefore, you have a different like thing they're going to focus on, which means that they're going to be more creative. Okay. Another thing, which is maybe a bit more direct, is just like you have a board of directors. They are oftentimes able to decide the general direction of the studio. So, direction. How does this kind of look like? This looks like, for example, them deciding what kind of movies are going to be greenlit or are going to spend money. What kind of characters do we, for example, want to maybe be able to sell plushies? What kind of brand deals are we going to get? Are we going to focus on series to put on Disney Plus? Are we going to focus on films to get people into the cinema? Are we going to focus on gaming and trying to maybe establish new things there? What is the maybe the target that we're going for? Are we going to try to create like a cinematic universe, or are we just going to have like one-on stuff? So there's a lot of things you could talk about here, which is what they are, like the powers that they have, and then the idea that is that these kind of like general directions are going to change because you're just going to have different people who have different perspectives that are going to like change like the way that you're going to the kind of like direction that they want. So maybe someone wants to focus on games, maybe someone wants to focus on movies, and then you just have different things that are catered to for different audiences. Another thing that you can maybe use is kind of like I guess I got like the tools used by studios. So you can say when you have, for example, Disney, they have maybe specific copyrights to not only characters, but maybe also specific production parts, or they use the kind of like same data set of test audiences. So before a movie or a series of times released, they test it for audiences, and then they're going to see what's their responses, what is needed to adapt, what needs to be changed, all that kind of stuff. You can say, well, you cannot really share all of that. You need to develop your own tools. You need to like create your own data sets, which means that you're going to try to be maybe a bit more creative. But also when it comes to data sets, for example, because you have now different people that you might ask, and like the general population is quite wide and varied, it might be that just the size that you have is slightly different, or it's just different than what you have from another studio, and therefore you just have like different things that you find out apparently people find important. So that's just a tool, and like I don't know, like maybe like stunt tools or things for special effects. You need to like now do your own things. And what else can you run? Well, you can also run the idea that you have a lot of power over the industry. So what you can say is when Disney owns like a lot of studios, you are much more likely to get into a yes man culture, and you're less likely to be maybe critical of things that the board of directors says. Um, So you might be less critical when they say, "Oh, we need to have a romance plot," because we find out from test audiences that if you have a romance plot, people actually care a bit more about the main character, but also women are more likely to enjoy the films and therefore we're able to cater to a wider audience and that kind of stuff. And they are more likely maybe to say like, "Actually, no, I don't want to do this," or maybe like hold your head because you could say there are other studios who might be willing to give me actually the opportunity. You can say like, or like you can also say the risk like I'm just going to take this creative risk, and if the studio now doesn't like me anymore, I can go to another studio afterwards. Even if I piss them off, then you know it isn't as bad. When it's Disney and they own a lot of studios, it becomes very hard for me to work in the industry in the first place. At that point, it's going to be quite bad for me. So you could say therefore you're going to have more creative, like creative choice and choices made. So what is then these are a couple of points I just came up with. These are 6 points. What I would do is I would not bring all of these 6 points. I would bring about 3 to 4 different points of mechanization. The reason being that if you do less, it is easily disproven, and says that you just need to have 2 lines of rebuttal to kind of like deal with it. 3 or 4, it oftentimes becomes that you need more time to disprove it, and it becomes quite hard, which means that most likely at least some point is still standing because someone might not be able to think of a rebuttal against it, or they just don't have time to rebut it. At that point, you have something standing, and that's overall good. If you do more than like 4, the main problem is you're spending a lot of time, which means that either you don't actually prove the mechanization fully and you're just asserting a couple of lines, at which point it isn't really actually mechanization, it's just like assertions, which are just like oftentimes either not believed or they're not strong, or maybe the judge doesn't understand what you exactly mean. So that's not good. But also, even if you don't fully explain each mechanization, the problem is you don't do things such as weighing, you don't do things such as rebuttal, you don't focus on other points in debate, you become too hyper focused, and then you might be outweighed because you just don't have an impact because you don't have time to impact. So overall, I would recommend 3 to 4 mechanizations that you pick, and you pick the strongest one. So then, what are the questions that you can ask yourself to maybe help yourself with maybe picking mechanization or coming up with it? So the first one is just kind of like what changes under this motion. So this motion happens, what changes? Um, let's just start with the immediately beginnings, which is just you have big Disney with big money, which implies that you're now going to have different studios. like smaller studios. What are these studios like? I think this is most likely going to be things such as Pixar, Marvel, 20th, oh, 20th Century Productions, which are the ones where you have like the blaring horns, like 20 logo. They apparently own that. Lucasfilms, which with Lucas Studios, which owns Star Wars and that kind of stuff. So the kind of note is these are technically maybe smaller studios than the conglomerate that is Disney, but the main problem is in the sense that I mean these are still relatively big, right? So these are still relatively big. What does this do with the debate? I think firstly, it serves as good mitigation because on the other side you might say, but you don't have the money to, for example, use these tools or to hire like good actors and that kind of stuff, or to use these data sets. But you can say, well, look, Marvel still makes a lot of millions, so most likely they can still do something like making like a cool special effect with Spider-Man doing sick tricks or something like that. But it also mean that when it comes to other analysis on why maybe, for example, Disney's bad because it's able to spam out a lot of advertisements, that doesn't really work because Marvel is also able to spam out a lot of advertisements because they also have a lot of money. So it becomes one of those cases where if you have maybe mechanization here about um, Disney spends money on advertisements. And the main problem is people oftentimes convinced by this. When you see it a lot, you're much more likely be like, oh, I actually want to go there. You're able to create buzz with a lot like new studios and that kind of stuff. I think at that point, you can't really bring this point because Marvel can already do it. Like maybe they can do it to a lesser extent, but the change is quite small. Unless you have maybe some specific spec on why Disney can do this and Pixar and Marvel can't. But on top of my head, I can't really think of anything. So this one kind of like basically gets crossed out, I guess. Um, yeah. So what other things do change in this motion? I think you can talk about like just the board of directors change. So you could say the people who are chosen they are going to be independent of Disney. So like they choose their own board of directors, they have their own managers, which don't need to listen to Disney. Uh, this then quite clearly just links to the argument about the board of directors. I guess and also to a certain extent kind of like the tools used by the studio. So there's some other stuff that we say like there's going to be a separation of tools or platforms. So for example, Disney Plus, like Disney Plus doesn't now get access to all of those series immediately because now most likely you need to pay, for example, for having access to Star Wars movies in the first place because you haven't bought the rights for that because you're broken up. So those kinds of things also change. Another thing that you could talk about is just like what happens is Disney gets broken up and this gets like public. So you could say people, for example, suddenly know that this is going to happen, know about this breakup. So there's going to be a lot of attention to it. But I feel like you can also say maybe there are different kind of expectations now. So you can say people are maybe very curious what will happen. So will Marvel still focus on, for example, PG-13 movies? Will Lucasfilms still focus on just creating like trilogies, or will they focus on games and that kind of stuff? So you can also say this creates like a unique capacity to change directions because you're able to maybe change the way the media or like the people have seen you because you can just make standpoints like, now that you've broken off from Disney, we're going to do this and that. So there's a unique capacity here to get people to see you suddenly is different or maybe capture a new audience that you hadn't before. Um, Similarly, you can talk about people know about this breakup, so you get attention. But what you might also have is like, for example, fear of investors. So investors now see that like Disney suddenly was very big. Now you have small studios, which are still relatively big, but they still might be curious to see how this is going to work, like I said, with the division of tools, or how is Disney Plus as a platform going to exist, and that kind of stuff. So you can also talk here about, I guess, in investors and how they see it. So yeah, these are kind of like things you could do. Um, Maybe at the moment you don't ask this question, you don't really think about this point where people just know about this like breakup. So then you don't maybe think about this unique opportunity to maybe do a rebranding, that kind of stuff, or how this maybe makes some of these arguments stronger. So those are things that you can Yeah, that's why it's good to ask questions because you're also thinking differently about this motion. So that is the first thing. The second thing is also very good because it forces you to be comparative. If you again don't understand that it will go to like most likely still relatively big studios, then points on again money being used just don't really work much because the comparative is still again big studios. And this goes wrong in a lot of good rooms still that people just are not that comparative. They just give a lot of reasons and then they forget to, oh wait, I need to explain why this is comparative, why this is unique to this motion. So another question that you can ask yourself is what actors are involved in media? The reason why it is good to ask yourself this question is because it allows you to see this motion through a different lens and maybe come up with mechanization that you hadn't thought of before. So you can talk about what can you talk about here, for example? I think you can talk about people who are directly just making the media. So these are things such as like script writers. You can talk about directors. Funnily enough, you can talk about actors quite literally. And then you can say these kind of like change their incentive or their capacity. So you'd be like, okay, how does their capacity change? I think you can say they're much more likely to be able to maybe stick it to the studio because there are other things they can go to, or they can maybe play off the different studios where like, oh, you don't want me to go to Marvel, I will then go to Lucasfilms and they will give me these projects. And normally Disney will be like, no, we don't want you at Lucas Studios, so you're going to do what we want you to do at Marvel. So that's, for example, one way to come up with this. Um, this is specifically capacity change. I don't think directly incentives change that much. Maybe you could talk about how the fact that Disney owns that many franchises means that you really want to like suck up to Disney because that means that when you do well at Star Wars, you're able to like do also like well at like Marvel because you're able to maybe translate that loyalty and that kind of stuff. But I guess to a certain extent, that's just maybe explaining the yes man culture a bit more. So okay, this is one thing that you could talk about. Another thing that you could talk about is just the management side. Again, the people who like hire directors who do the general direction and all that kind of stuff. You could talk about how most likely they are actually going to you know also change their behavior. So this is looking, for example, in fact, they're going to be quite different. They're going to maybe have different perceptions and that kind of stuff. So what you again need to do here is what you need to do with a lot of points is you need to do either capacity or analysis or incentive analysis. So you say they used to have this incentive, but they don't have that capacity. So for example, they wanted to make a lot of like creative movies, but they didn't have the capacity under Disney. Then you kind of like get to the point about the yes man culture. But you can also say actually the interests now change. And I mean, capacity also changed because they now run their own studio. You can say they already had the opportunity to decide which movies that they had, but now the incentive for what movie they're going to pick is going to be different. And here you also get into like characterization more. So how do these people look like? So like I said, I already explained how they got power about general direction, focus on films and like studios or series and that kind of stuff. But what you can also say is like who is picking them? Why is this kind of like going to change under this motion? Like linking to the other question, and the thing you can say is, okay, film industry is an industry which is again commercialized. It has companies, but you can say there's oftentimes still something unique about the fact that it is film because there's an inherently creative like sector that you're working in. So what it means is people want to work with you or under your company if they feel like you are also creative and allowing that creativity. Or you could say there is more an idea that you should be like a visionary, an entrepreneur trying to change these things. So an example of this was if you look at the original Walt Disney, he tried to push, for example, for having animation and tried to do that in a very different way, and that got him like quite popular and was able to why he was became quite big. But another thing that he had was like projects which were creating cities for artists, where it would be a self-sustaining city where artists could live and they could like produce all of this art and that kind of stuff. And this was like a lot of like people had respect for that and really liked him and like wanted him to be like the manager of the studio because not only does it then make the artist feel like wanted and desired and also like like we are very important, we should have our own city and like we should get money and that kind of stuff. But it's also one of those things where you just kind of like glorify people who are going to be innovators, who are going to be creative, who are able to do things that you never thought were possible. So you could say that even if there's going to be a commercial aspect to it, there's still going to be, because of this, going to be still some desire from within the studio, and from people in management to kind of like have this visionary and that kind of stuff. And then you can say, um, the problem with the other points, like in the Disney, is even if there was that desire, because everything was so top down and people were making decisions were quite far away from these studios, what people want on the ground, they often just have more of this top down mentality. As well as Disney became so big, it wasn't just about film and media, that they didn't really care necessarily about the film studio, that kind of part, because they also created like news, like media. They also had like theme park, those other stuff that they had, which are inherently more commercial. So it's like, again, it's like a dilution of the dilution of like interests, which were like non-commercial, like a dilution of non-commercial interest by having more commercial interest, because there are other sectors that also are at play here. So again, this is a way to characterize this. So again, think about capacity incentive analysis and then do it. Okay, who else are actually kind of like involved in this media? So I guess what you can also talk about is just consumers. So again, people just need to watch this. But I think like for consumers, you can also think of different groups. So you have people who are just like big Disney fans who like will watch anything Disney, who think like it's very great, who like, really support like maybe the old Disney as well, and then just want to watch like all the Star Wars and all the Marvel things, and they're like really in love with anything Disney. They have a Disney Plus account, they go to Disney World, they get all crazy, all of that kind of stuff. So you can say most likely there are ways that they're going to change their behavior. So much like they'll be a bit sad because again, they don't have those platforms. It might be more expensive to go to Disney World because you now need to pay more royalties, all of that kind of stuff. Um, you can either mitigate this, which is, oh, you can still cooperate, everyone has the interest, so therefore you're going to keep prices low, or other kind of things. But if you're going to like mitigate this and say you're still going to try to cooperate to a very large extent with each other, if that is the case, then that might hurt your own arguments about why they differentiate. Because again, if it's just very similar to what it is in the status quo, then maybe the reason why you would have different interests also doesn't change, because you still want to align on all of these big projects. So that's another thing. Bite the bullet sometimes and just talk about other people. What are other people then? I guess you can talk people who have a bit more of a niche interest. So these are people who are a bit more along the lines of what is it, like the Star Wars fans, the superhero fans, that kind of stuff, who really care about, for example, Marvel, but not necessarily about the other material that exists. So then you can say these people also change, or like their interest now gets focused on, for example. So this is another thing to talk about. And then the last group is just, I guess, the general public. So the general public is something that is like who don't really care that much. They don't really have that big of a stake in like if it's Disney or if it's like a small studio. They'll just go watch movies on either side. They just want to be interested. Okay, so you can keep these into account, and then you can make arguments specifically on why the incentive of these change. So you can say, if you are, for example, a studio, to which one are you going to cater? Are you going to cater to the general audience that you had before, so the families and fan stuff, or like families side, or like the more casual people, or are you going to maybe go for the niche interest ones? It is kind of like, what is it? Kind of like these the target audience, but it does actually require you to do analysis because again, the very easy OO rebuttal is currently you have a lot of big fans who want to, for example, like there are a lot of people who go to Marvel movies, and these are a general audience. You want to remain that general audience because it makes you a shit ton of money. So you're actually not going to have a different audience. You're going to just continue with the audience you had. Um, so you need to do something else to actually explain why that incentive changes. And I feel like the way that you're able to actually prove that is by doing things when it, which is problem analysis, and that's what we're going to get at now. So oftentimes you can just give a mechanization, which is like I said here, you have a target audience, which is this general audience, and then they say this kind of like changes. But then you need to say, what is the problem? Like, why do you care about these general audiences? And why did that specifically change here? And I think this is, again, something that misses oftentimes within mechanization, which makes it less strong because it's just, because again, one, it is unclear why you actually solve an issue. But two, at the moment you do strong problem analysis, you're also able to actually explain why there's likely for things to change. So if you're saying the main reason why there's a lack of creativity is because of this reason, and we change that reason, then you're more likely to actually be believed rather than if you just rattle off a couple of points on why something changes. So what then is the problem that creates a lack of diversity? So I think a specific one is you have big projects that cost millions or sometimes billions of dollars. So special effects, having expensive actors, all of that kind of stuff. So that point is that just costs a lot of money. Um, and then you want to be risk averse to kind of like recuperate because you don't want to take like the risk that you might just like lose billions of dollars. That's just really bad for investors, really bad for you as a company. You don't want to do it. What is then what is the problem with this analysis just by itself is if you have studios such as Marvel and Lucas Studios who are going to be big on either side, then they also have big projects, right? Because you said most likely you can still do special effects, most likely you can still do actors. So it doesn't make sense to say that you're not going to be risk averse. What you need to do now is you need to explain why does the risk of something change. So what you can say here, for example, is currently you're not really competing with the same audience because at the moment that, for example, Marvel makes a bit more money and it doesn't like come at the cost of Star Wars, it doesn't really matter because again it's like one big company, so the flow in money is able to go to each other anyway, so there's not really a competition. But at the moment that you now have a competition for the general audience, you might, for example, battle for the same spot. You want people to not spend money to Star Wars but only to Marvel compared to spending it at both. So now you're going to have this risk. What this means is you're going to have a battle for people, and the problem is you might actually lose this battle. So it might be that Marvel is able to create like a super good movie, but now suddenly means that people are not going to watch your Star Wars movie. At that point, you can say it is easier for you to try to focus more to your niche group. So you can say, because there is now this uncertainty if you're actually able to capture that audience, it is likely for you to focus on, for example, this like Star Wars audience, with maybe too willing to pay for more money and that kind of stuff. So you can just say you have less of capacity to actually capture that market. Therefore, you need to change your incentives. You have different incentives. That is kind of like the thing you could talk about. Or similarly, you could say you don't have the benefits that are unique to Disney. So you don't have the benefits which are like the Disney Plus like things channels and Disney Plus like subscription where they're able to advertise you and like make you push like the different series because you cannot really like cooperate with other studios to say, oh, you're going to make this kind of series, then we're going to make this kind of series because then we're kind of like compatible. We're talking about different audiences and that kind of stuff. So therefore, you're going to go what is like less risky, which is the people that you already know. So you can just say it changes because the risk specifically changes because you can't cooperate um, and might lose the competition. Okay, so this is why it's important because if you just think of it by yourself and you just think maybe of this specific mechanization, which is competition leads to kind of like you fighting for an audience, which means that you're going to push for example, new creative things or you cater to a niche and that kind of stuff. You need to explain why you're going to cater to that niche. And you need to explain why in the alternative, you're less likely to do that. The less likely to do it is now because of like the risk aversion. And then you now are going to be, again, because that was the problem, risk aversion, this analysis becomes like stronger because it explains to you why the risk aversion actually changes. And this is what I mean with having more specificity. The moment you have more specific analysis, it's like, this is the problem, this is how it changes, this is why this is the most important thing. At that point, you're able to then explain why you're going to get more diverse movies. Um, Also, maybe to explain like more diverse movies, like the idea is as well to say that you're going to get movies that people enjoy more. So if every studio kind of like does this, then Star Wars people get more Star Wars movies that they like because they get more spin-offs because they need to listen more to the audience, whereas Marvel does it differently. Okay, what else can you say what the problem is? The problem is that there's a focus on specific brands. So you could say currently within Disney, the biggest kind of like things that are happening are Marvel and Star Wars. That's also why I've been using all of these examples. Marvel and Star Wars. So what you can say is it is very easy for Disney to just continue focusing on these focusing on these brands, right? Because people are already aware of them, so having a new movie is something that they're interested in. When you're able to expand it as well, so like when Marvel is really big, like Marvel plushies become bigger, like the figurines plastic also become bigger. You're able to like get more people to, for example, come to Disney World because people like Marvel, so they want to see the new Marvel thing that you have there, all that kind of stuff. So you focus on these brands, and because you have this name recognition, then you're going to continue doing this. The thing here though is if this is true, because it's very easy, it's very cheap, they need to explain why on the other side this is going to be less. So why on big Disney and like sorry, if you have like small studios like Marvel and like Lucas Studios, they don't actually have this. I would say one, I think most likely they still have the incentive. If they just want to make relatively quick money, then most likely again you're going to continue this because it's, I should say, cheap and relatively easy. What you can say does actually change is that there might be other studios that Disney has bought that they kind of like made like kind of like they make movies, but they take the profit that they have to then put that profit into Marvel and Star Wars and not in those studios. So you can say for those studios it does change because their money gets taken away. So for them actually they just now have suddenly capacity to create their own movies. Since these are different studios with different things that they cater to, you basically get more movies that they're able to produce. You get more of this diversity. That's the first thing that you can talk about here on this specific problem. So you have these like smaller studios don't give profits to Marvel. Another thing you can talk about here is like I guess to a certain extent capacity, which is you can say the reason why like Disney focuses on this brand specifically is because they want to branch out, right? It is the plushies that make a lot of money. It is the Disney World that makes a lot of money. Like small spin-off series on Disney Plus make a lot of money, and they continue subscription and that kind of stuff. So you say the capacity to do those kind of like changes, like maybe not plushies because Marvel most likely can do plush on each side, but like then creation of like what's it called, Disney World and like the creation of their own streaming services is less likely, and they're less likely to make profit from this because again if like there's now going to be another company like Netflix who wants to make profits, they don't want to like they're going to buy it, but they're not going to completely share the profits that they have. Whereas if it's Disney Plus, you're going to share completely the profits because it's the same company. So you can say those are the costs. The analysis here would be then something along the lines of the most important things where you don't have access to those platforms are going to be very damaging to the company, which means the company now needs to recuperate this loss by promoting like other kind of films and like producing these kind of films to get a wider audience or to get their audience to buy stuff and that kind of stuff. The problem is with this analysis is it's somewhat factually untrue because the main thing that gives like Disney also a lot of money is actually not like that's Disney World or even like Disney Plus, but it's things such as plushies, the fact that people are buying merch such as like shirts and that kind of stuff. And to the extent that you can most likely still do that as Marvel, like this mechanism would technically be a scam. I personally feel like it's a scam because I don't think it works in life, but you might just bring it in debate because again, sometimes in debate, you don't have enough time to actually think of an actual reason and you know it might not be true, but then you kind of like just need to scam because maybe it sounds plausible or the outside at least needs to react to it. So sometimes when you're not fully convinced, it's okay to scam a little. Don't make it the whole part of the case, but like a scamming mechanism here and there is absolutely fine, I think. So that's the other stuff that you can talk about here. So it's like platforms that you don't have access to. Um, what else can we talk about? Another thing is just I think also maybe most intuitive. Maybe we should start with is just kind of like lack of diversity within boardrooms. So you say when the people who are going to make these decisions are always going to be the same people, that kind of like changes. Um, if you notice, this is just what you need to do here is characterization on why this changes. So then you need the characterizations that I had here for management. So why do they have these incentives to be diverse and different, but do they not have the capacity on the other side? Um, so explain the incentives, the lack of capacity under Disney. And I feel like after you've done that, you're able to then make the case strong that you have, for example, here on the board of directors. Also, kind of like the tools used by the studios and that kind of stuff also becomes part of this. Um, yeah, and then kind of like trickles down to things such as target audience and that kind of stuff. So this is also an interesting thing to see, which is if you are able to, for example, explain what the board of directors wants, and you're able to explain that this kind of like trickles down to which audience they're going to focus on, this target audience argument actually becomes a like I guess like a consequence or like a submech of this because the to change why explain why the target audiences change is because the board of directors like is changing what they are focusing on. So you can say the one is prior to the other or logically downstream or something along those lines. And that's why it's important to ask these questions, because you might think that these two are maybe the strongest mechanization, but then you realize they're actually based on the same framing. They're based on the idea that you're going to change what you want to invest in via this board of directors. So if you try to like explain it via this lack of diversity in boardrooms, and therefore lack of diversity in the things that they want, and therefore also the lack of diversity in target audience, this just like again is the same framing. The problem with this is if someone defeats this framing or has counter framing on this, you're basically screwed because now both of your mechanizations are not standing. But if you're explaining that the target audiences change because the risk changes on like where you might or might not lose money, then at that point you have two different framings that explain why you get a change. And that means that you do need to have at least two different counter frames or two different kinds of rebuttal to it. Um, and that's why it's also so important to actually focus on this problem analysis, because it forces you to think about what is it actually that is going to change. Like, and also it means if you think about this and you listen to other people's speeches and you feel like, but wait a minute, the problem that they have is just explaining why, like, for example, the risk aversion changes, then you can say, if I just defeat that, I defeat all of the mechanisms. So even if they bring like four mechanisms, but they all depend on the same framing, then you could just beat them on that. So yeah. Um, and lastly, I guess where you can also say it's a slightly different thing, but I guess you could say like the problem is the focus on homogenization by Disney. So you can say, why do they want to homogenize is to translate audiences. Again, the problem with this is if you want to translate audience because it gives you a lot of money, as we said before, most likely if you're Marvel and you want to have access to general public already, this doesn't change. You can do again the change analysis that I said, but then it would be again that would be basically this explanation again, which wouldn't actually be a new problem analysis. But maybe a specific problem analysis that you could talk about is the other platforms that you had. For example, again, Disney Plus, where the focus is not actually on creating like new and good series, it's just having a lot of series so that people are able to watch it and they're able to binge watch it. And if it's very similar, people often are fine with that and that kind of stuff. Or a specific problem is because you are tied to kind of like the kind of plushies that you want to sell or the kind of like experience you want to sell in theme parks and that kind of stuff. You're able to um you're able to kind of like be restricted in kind of like what you're able to create. And if you're also going to be somewhat critical, there's actually basically a slight variation of this one, which is a focus on specific brands. So maybe even theme parks actually isn't that new, but maybe specifically just focusing on Disney Plus is something that might just be a specific problem that you're able to highlight and explain why this is actually so big. So yeah, this was basically the video where it was me just explaining how to think of mechanization. I hope this is clear. I hope it is like you understand what I'm doing and why I'm doing it and why it's going to be useful. So maybe to also have a slight summary, I think there are three main questions you can ask yourself during prep time to be able to work on your mechanization. Firstly is what changes under this motion? Secondly, you can talk about what actors are involved in like this motion. And then thirdly, what is the problem that actually is now going to be solved? And then I think there's also a sub question that basically came by, which is where you're talking about an actor and you're explaining why it changes. The best thing to ask yourself is, does the incentive change or does the capacity change or do both change and how do they interact? So that's another way to maybe think of different like mechanizations, but also makes you think about the burdens because in the end, for you to explain why an actor changes, you do need to explain why both the incentives and the capacities like align. So that being said, I hope this is clear. If you have any more questions, please let me know in the comments and then see you in the next video.